Research that I have been aware of, and a lot of you are probably aware of most of it too, over the last few years, and I've taken that research and said, what implications does it have in the workplace? You know, a lot of times in design, we sort of bemoan the fact we don't have a lot of research, but there's actually quite a bit that's done in different disciplines, different communities, whether it's environmental design research, whether it's sociology and psychology research, perhaps ergonomics research, and even research for management and colleges of psychology and HR, for example, organizational dynamics. But I find often what happens is that research sort of gets put away on a shelf and it doesn't really make it to the design community. So my goal in this presentation was to try and take some of those, as I said, the top 10 ones that I think that are having any effect whatsoever on the workplace, and just talk a little bit about those. Now, the first one we're going to start with is one that we went into a lot more detail last night, and that was this idea that most interaction in the workplace happens at someone's desk. Now, I know that there's a lot of mythology around collaboration in the workplace. It's a hot topic. I'm sure your companies are all interested in it, and your clients are all asking you about collaboration. And collaboration, we know, is important. There's a reason that people are asking about it. It's because there's plenty of literature, especially coming out of organizational dynamics and sort of people who do workplace strategy, that shows a definite link between the quality of collaboration in the workplace and all sorts of performance outcomes, you know, around innovation and productivity and even engagement. But one of the myths that sort of pervades this field is this notion that we have to create all of these sorts of spaces for collaboration to happen, especially informal interaction, which is the most robust type of collaboration in the workplace. But as I mentioned last night, if you think about it, most people don't really say, hey, let's go down to the informal interaction space and interact formally. You know, that's not really the way it happens. In fact, what we know is that 70, 80, even 90% in R&D facilities of interaction happens at somebody's desk, right? And this is research based on lots of tracking individuals and where they're interacting with each other. And if you think about your own situation, it's perfectly natural. I mean, you get up, you walk around, you're going to the break room, you're going to maybe the copy machine, and somebody sees you as you walk near and past their desk, and they go, hey, come here a second, right? Or you walk past somebody's office door, or if there's some people in a conference room, you look at it and you go, oh, you know, I've been meaning to ask you this. So we call this the drop-in moment, or the doorway moment, or some people call it the drive-by moment, but that sounds like shooting, so I like to use it. Now, what does this mean for us in design? I think it means a couple of things. The first thing it means is that we always need to make sure that we provide a place for a second person at every desk, right? And by the way, this handout that you have at your desk hopefully has all this information summarized for you, but it's very important to provide a second place for everyone to sit at your desk, not only for this sort of collaboration, but it does other great things too for the organization. First off, it reduces noise, particularly in an open environment, because if I'm going to stand at your workstation and talk to you, I'm going to have a certain volume of noise. But as soon as I get a chair and pull up next to you at your desk, side by side, I'm not even talking about across, I'm talking about side by side, of course, I immediately lower my voice. And also, we're at eye level, side by side, sitting next to each other, usually within our personal bubble. Remember from sociology when we learned about the bubbles, the personal space, and the social space, and the intimate space? Well, when you sit with a colleague, if you get inside that bubble space, it automatically ratchets up your relationship. You know, it gets you to be a little bit more comfortable with people. So there's lots of reasons to do this. Now, my personal preference is a small chair on wheels without arms, like a caper chair, which is what the chairs in the break room here, but without arms and on wheels. But it can be a stool, you know, as I said last night, it can be a peach crate. It doesn't really matter, it's got to be something. Now, for a long time, we talked about the mobile bed as a solution to that. It's not a bad solution. I personally am not. I prefer a chair because it's more comfortable, it's lighter weight, it's easier to pull around, and sometimes the mobile beds can get kind of heavy if they're loaded down. But the bottom line is having the second place. And you know, last night again I was mentioning the fact that sometimes we get RFPs where it'll say we need, let's say, 6x6 workstations for everyone, but the managers get 6x8 or 6x9, and I've all seen that. And I'll call and I'll say, well, now why is that? Even though, of course, I know exactly why, but I'll ask them anyway. And the answer is always the manager needs a place for a second person to sit. And my sort of pushback on that is, no, everybody needs a place for a second person to sit. In fact, I would actually argue that the manager shouldn't get a second place for a person to sit because they need to get up and go out and be sitting with their team. Now, the other thing that we talked about last night is if you have a company that talks about increasing collaboration and they really want to get people sort of talking to each other outside their little nucleus of their small 3 or 4 person group, it's important that people get up and move around the organization. And it's not just for collaboration. Again, it's for just general awareness of what this organization is doing, a sense of belonging, seeing the people that you work for. And the presentation we did last night went into great depth on how you can create space that can actually increase the opportunities for people to move around and have these informal interactions. And what we focused on last night was manipulating the layout of the space, looking at the average distances between people, and how that affects collaboration, and finally looking at the degree of visibility. If you weren't able to come last night and you think you'd like to learn more about that, I often give that presentation in webinar, so I can do it. If you call me, we can set it up and I can do it with your company, because it's a pretty cool method of analyzing and even comparing plans. And this method works so well that it not only describes existing collaboration patterns, it actually predicts future collaboration patterns, right? So this is pretty cool. It's called Space Syntax if you want to know more about it. Now, the next piece of research that I want to talk about is, computer there, so we are, is research that comes not from the collaboration discipline, which is the area that I've always worked in, but research that comes from space utilization studies. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the last few years, again, about compressing space, and people are generally aware of the fact that space is not getting fully utilized. And remember, when I say utilization, that's different than vacancy and occupancy. I hear people mix up the term occupancy. Is it occupied or utilized? But if you want to use sort of definitions that are mostly used in the industry, and certainly the ones we use at Herman Miller, vacancy and occupancy are sort of two sides of the same coin, right? And they mean the percentage of spaces that are assigned to somebody or something. They are not empty in the sense that someone could be assigned to them, right? But on the other hand, utilization is of those spaces that are occupied by somebody, is there actually at any given moment someone sitting there? So, for example, that office may be occupied by Al, but it's not being utilized by Al right now, right? That's the difference. And what companies, of course, are aware of is the fact that in most of their space, there's some pretty low utilization numbers out there. Now, one of the things that we do at Herman Miller is we do a pretty robust study program for clients, particularly if they're trying to figure out how much space they need, or the other side of that coin, how many people they can accommodate in the space they have. That's two ways of looking at space utilization. And we do very robust studies with a motion detector. We actually put under people's chairs and we do studies for 3 weeks. The motion detector sends a signal back to a wireless router every 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And it shows you over a 3-week period exactly what your utilization is. Now, one of the interesting things we do before we do studies, we usually ask people to tell us what they think their utilization is. And guess what the average we hear? Anybody want to guess what the average utilization we hear is? What people think they're in their seats, what percentage of the time? 80, 85, and 90%. That's what they think. And of course, what do we find when we actually do it? It's about 40%, right? And that's across the board. It's across many, many industries. It doesn't matter if you're in manufacturing, if you're in the service industry, if you're in banking, finance, insurance, education. It's pretty much across the board. The only place we see slightly higher utilizations are organizations that have big customer support and call center, because those people generally are at their desk all day long, right? Organizations that have lots of consultants and salespeople, those numbers are even lower. Private offices, who wants to guess what the average utilization of a private office is in the United States right now? Remember, they're assigned to somebody that should be in there, supposedly. Anybody want to guess what that number is? It's actually lower than that. It's actually about 28%. Right? And the thing about these offices, they're usually prime real estate. They're more real estate, and they're usually prime real estate. So, of course, what we're seeing in response to that is organizations really struggling with what do we do with this space. that I do with clients sometimes is once we do these utilization studies, we'll take that data and we will say, okay, now here are 4 different possible scenarios for setting up a mobility or flex or alternate work, whatever you call it, program. And here's 4 different ways that you might organize the space or lay the space out based on these categories of mobility, where some people are resident, they're there all the time. Some people are flex, most of us probably fall into that category. We're in our seats about half the time, the other half the time we're all over the place. We may be at work, but we're just not at our desk all the time. And then you have people who are truly sort of mobile. They're hardly ever in their seat. And so when you look at that sort of 3 ways of describing space, you can start to use this data to set up scenarios that help clients really take advantage of the fact that not all their workstations are being used. Now, that was about workrooms, or rather workplaces and offices. We also do this utilization data in conference rooms. And what we find is, first off, who wants to guess what the average size conference room is in the United States in terms of number of seats at the table? I think maybe 1, 2, 8. Believe it or not, that conference room right there is smaller than the average conference room in the United States. The average conference room in the United States has 14 seats at a table. And it's because we got a lot of really big conference rooms. You know, we've got a lot of spaces where people said, I've got to have a place for my whole team to meet or whatever, right? So actually, the average conference room is about 14 seats. But what is the average size meeting? Well, here's this graphic on the wall to show you, right? 3.5 people, that's my half a person, right? That's the average meeting. Now, these meetings are generally scheduled meetings. Because let's remember, most informal interaction, unscheduled meetings, are between 2 people and happen in a desk in an office. Most scheduled formal meetings, even if it's if I call you and say, hey, let's get together in 10 minutes, that's a scheduled meeting. Or if it's a standing meeting on the calendar, the average size of those meetings is 3.5 people. And you've all seen in your own office or in your client's offices, you watch around and see big conference rooms like that. But I did it today. I used this room, for 3 hours, 1 person or 2 people or 3 people in a big room. Now, the other thing that we've learned from our data, besides the fact that we probably need more conference rooms, but they need to be smaller. And let me just also mention that our data does show that conference rooms are pretty heavily used. In fact, when your client says we need more conference rooms, they probably do, right? But they would probably all be much smaller. The bottom line is you really don't know until you do some robust studies. You can use the motion detectors, you can hire interns to go over clipboards, Some people like to compare the VPN logins to IP logins. Some people are playing with sort of video technology. Al, I think you're doing some stuff with flow analysis and all to try and get at some better numbers that we can actually use, right? Now, one other thing we did find out in our data collection and by the way, I should mention that in the past 7 years, Herman Miller has completed 70 major studies that represent about 25,000 chairs. Okay? So these are big studies, and as I mentioned, they're across all industries. One of the other things we found is that rooms, conference rooms, or any kind of meeting room that has display technology, even if it's just a projector sitting on the table or a whiteboard that you can project onto or hook up to, those rooms tend to be used 4 times more often than similar rooms in the same building that don't have that technology. And I believe that this is only something that's going to get even more sort of profound. And I was telling someone, we were talking about this last night, design is one of the very few professions where we can actually sit and go over our work and change our work without computers, because we still use trash and paper and we draw. But most professions that I work with, as soon as you get 3 or 4 people in a room and they want to talk about projections or something, they want to see a spreadsheet or they want to see a PowerPoint and they want documents. So most organizations that I work with today, to get together for 3 or 4 people and just sit in a room and talk, that doesn't happen very often. They're generally wanting to share a resource. So I think that has some great implications for the types of space that we offer. Now, the next thing has to do with literature that comes from the HR literature and the organizational dynamic literature. And it's all around engagement. Now, if you follow engagement and all, and by the way, engagement is really just another way of saying recruitment and retention. worker satisfaction, performance. These are all just euphemisms for basically engagement, which is sort of an umbrella term. And we have a lot of organizations that come to us, and I'm sure you do too, that say, we're concerned about recruitment and retention. Our demographic bubble is shifting. Most organizations now are beginning to see a real surge in retirement. A lot of the leadership in their organization. We're getting a lot of sort of millennials in. What can we do to design space that's going to support the next generation, right? Because our generation, we're out the door, right? What we're designing for, especially if you're designing a building that's going to last 15 to 20 years, which, by the way, 15 years is about the average size of the length of a renovation, right? So what you're designing for right now is going to last you to almost 2030, right? So what's different about these, especially millennials, is there's a real emphasis on connectedness and on feedback and the ability to see the people that you work for and the people that you aspire to be and feel like you're part of something great. Particularly with millennials, and it's not just millennials, all of us, we need feedback and we need recognition for our work. In fact, McKinsey, the consulting group, does a big study every year, and several other people do them. Gallup does them on engagement. You may know the Gallup polls. They're very famous on engagement. Other organizations do it. And lately we're seeing organizations like Monster.com and Indeed and Just Hire and Glassdoor, these websites. They are also polling their subscribers to find out, why do you stay in this organization? Why are you leaving this organization? What would it take for you to stay in this organization? And when you look at all of this research, there's a couple of big themes that come out. The first one is that the primary driver of motivation in the workplace is not money, it's praise from my boss. We're raising a generation of people who want praise and recognition. It's like we were talking about, when you go out on the soccer team at the end of the year, everybody gets a trophy, right? Even if it's a shin pad, right? It doesn't matter. Everyone gets a trophy now. It's all about that sort of, giving people feedback and a sense of encouragement and motivation and self-esteem. So it does not surprise me that when you look at the workplace, the same thing is true. People want people to tell them they're doing a good job. They want that feedback and they want it right away. The second most important driver is recognition by senior leadership. Do the people I work for even know who I am? Can I see them? Can they see me? Are they up in an ivory tower and they never come down here where the work bees are? That's not the kind of message that inspires young people or new people to the organization, right? It doesn't inspire people. I'll tell you, this is a great story about Martha Stewart. She's got an office in New York in this big loft space. It's a very large loft space, and everyone has an open office. Martha Stewart has a private office. It's enclosed with glass on all four sides. It's right in the middle of her space. There's no curtains, there's no blinds, there's no frosted pattern. You can't touch a button and the glass goes white or anything like that, right? Because she has an intrinsic understanding that the people who work for her, who we admit must love her and would work for her, right? She's got a strong personality. That there's a real surge of pride and excitement and enthusiasm and energy when you're sitting in a space and you can see the person you work for, especially if it's someone like Martha Stewart, right? It really jazzes people up and gets them excited about work. When you're a manager or your boss or the people or the leadership that hired you, that you want to work for and you want to be like, are on the 15th floor and use separate elevators and you never see them, you never have that opportunity to really be a mentor. And speaking of mentoring, also related to this notion of engagement, is there's a real return to mentoring. Mentoring was very popular in the 60s and 70s, and we saw it sort of die off for a while, sort of in the 80s and the Reagan go-go time. It kind of fell off a little bit, but it's coming back now. Mentoring is not being assigned someone and taking them to lunch every 6 weeks. Mentoring is that person sitting next to you all the time and hearing what you're doing, right? Now, I mentioned praise from your boss. I mentioned recognition by senior leadership. The third big driver of engagement in the workplace is actually the possibility that I'm going to be selected to participate in an important project in this organization. The fourth one is money. But for those first three, and also this notion of inspiration and awareness, and I belong to something great, from a design standpoint, you got to have transparency. If people can't see what's going on, then you can put in ping pong tables. We talk about this beanbag chairs and a dry cleaner, let people bring their pets to work, and all these sort of cliche things that people do for engagement. But nothing beats seeing the people that you admire and you like working with and seeing what's going on in the organization. So when companies come to you, or managers, or bosses, or directors come and say, you know, I gotta have solid walls and doors because I don't want people seeing what I'm doing, you know, what's the first response? What are you doing? Yeah. What's going on behind that door? And the second one is, oh yeah, you do. You do. You want people to see you because you want to be seen as a valuable part of this organization. Do you know in 2009, remember we had sort of a bad economic downturn. I don't know what happened up here in Cincinnati, but in Atlanta, at my design firm, in one day, 75 people were let go. In Atlanta, it was a bloodbath, right? And do you know that a lot of the people who were let go, you know who they were? They weren't the 25, 26, 30, 32-year-olds. They were the 55, 56, pushing 60-year-old people who all had private offices and were behind walls and you couldn't see them. Now, sure, part of the reason they probably got let go is because they make the most money. If you're going to save money in an organization, you're going to go where the money is, right? But there's also that notion that I don't see you, I don't see what you're doing, I don't understand the value you have. Now that may not be a good perception, they may be very valuable, but there's something about that out of sight, out of mind. So what I generally tell people who are sort of my age, around my age, and they're reluctant to be seen while they're working, is you want to sit in the smack dab middle with your sleeves rolled up and show everybody that you're a valuable part of this organization. That's a whole cultural shift for a lot of companies, but it's a really important one, right? Any thoughts on that before we move on? Does anybody in your head sort of issues with their internal clients or their external clients or pushing back on transparency?
I think a lot of it depends on the type of firm. I think a marketing firm, you're going to have it. I think when you have a financial institution or a law firm.
See, I'm going to push back on you, and I'm going to say we have to be careful not to confuse enclosure with transparency. It is true that what a lot of people do, because they're mostly heads down, they're autonomous, they're not in a team environment, they need to work on their own in quiet. That doesn't mean that they don't need a private office, but we should be able to see into it. In fact, I've done whole workplaces where everyone has a private office, but there's still lots of transparency and excitement. I mean, this is kind of a good thing. So I would say that even if you're a law firm and a financial firm, it's still important to have transparency with, you're right, Jane, with enclosure, though, right? There's no industry that will not benefit from being more open for its organization. Yes, ma'am?
My firm in Nashville, we used to think about our open workstations as mentoring without assignment.
Right.
Because there's so much that's learned just by osmosis because you hear someone else doing it. And I think it helps people take responsibility. If I hear someone where they're making a big mistake, it may not be my project, but it certainly is my responsibility to with every cue I have to.
I mean, that's that notion of what I was talking about, awareness, and you belong to something bigger than yourself. You know, Jocelyn LaSalle last year did a study. I can send you a copy of it. It's pretty interesting. They were looking at ethical violations, not mistakes, but ethical violations. Everything from, you know, insider trading, actual subterfuge and theft to just, you know, taking paper clips or telling a client, no, we don't have that, we can't do that, when in fact, you know, you could, right? Sort of laziness, if you will. And what they found was they looked at the clients who moved from a pretty traditional closed environment, you couldn't see anything, and they all moved to open environments. And what they found was all levels of reported ethical violations dropped dramatically. The assumption was that it dropped because you could see everybody now, and nobody was going to do anything wrong because they could get caught now, because you could see someone stealing the red stapler, right? But in fact, that's not what was going on. What was going on was, as the boundaries came down, or there was more transparency, right? I'm not anti-private office, but there was more transparency. What happened was everybody got a greater sense of we're all together, we're a family, we're in this, we're all pulling this rope forward, right? And I'm not going to do that to these people. Whereas when you're in an insulated little cell and you're just a little cog in a wheel and you can't see how you fit in, who cares if I steal this? You know, the company's got tons of them. I can take all these toner cartridges home myself and recycle them. Hey, there's a job option. But anyway, the point is you don't have a feeling like you're connected. So, and you know, the thing about it is, Catherine, that brings up a good point, is in design firms, we've always worked out in the open. And so when our clients are like, I can never work that way, and you're like, blown out by a tornado tomorrow, and your boss had to go hire a gymnasium and just set up chairs and tables with a sign that says, here be marketing, here be finance, I guarantee you would get your work. You might work better. So you don't need all of that around you, but transparency is still important for a lot of reasons. Yes, ma'am?
Just a quick question. So if we can't get total transparency, like clear glass, how do you feel about light frosting for exec offices and conference rooms, trying to get them to total transparency?
I think it's a really bad compromise. I don't like frosting. I think it sends mixed messages. We're clear, we're not clear, what's going on. Transparency is a value when it's expressed in architecture, signifies we are a transparent company and we trust you. If I put frosting up on windows, it's like saying I don't trust the people I work with to see what I'm doing. I think it's a really bad, I mean, I'd rather just see a solid wall and a door and leave your door open. Transparency sends a really mixed message, and I've never been a fan of it for that reason. I just think, again, what are you doing? It's so bad. I mean, look at this, is all totally clear. And I don't want to pick on you because you're sitting right there in front of your office, but some people will say, I can't work like that because I'm going to be constantly distracted. But what happens when you work in an environment like this all the time?
They can all see when you become engaged.
It just becomes natural. You're just not even aware of it. What's actually more disturbing is to have a solid wall and a door, and every once in a while somebody blips by. or some places, like I was in a place one time where I was trying to get them to put glass in their conference rooms, and they were saying, well, no, our teams can't be interrupted. And so they had a solid wall and door, and every minute somebody poked in like this. And I would say, that's interruption. If you had glass, people would just walk by. I said, well, what if they see what we're working on? I said, well, what if they do? I mean, if we're all in this together and it's a big team, and then first off, if they were really going to learn it, they'd have to stay in there with the glass like this for a minute. You'd probably turn and go, can I help you? But most people don't care, and they're going to keep on walking. The other thing about it is some people will say, well, I need frosted glass on my screen because I keep my computer turned this way, and if people are walking by, they can see what's on my computer. No, they can't. You try it. You cannot see it. I mean, I can't read my computer from here, right? I travel for a living, and I try and read the laptop on the person next to me on the airplane all the time. I tell you, you cannot see what's on that thing. So what you hear a lot of times, of course, is when people say all that stuff, it's really masking something else, concern for their perception of status in the organization. And this false sense of privacy and confidentiality, which you want to say. I would actually, when companies come to me and talk about they need their privacy and they need their confidentiality, it's like, that's for home. Privacy is for home. Workers were coming together and getting things done. Yet, might you have some sensitive information that if a competitor saw it, it could undermine your company? Yeah, but you probably don't have that large print printed on your wall and your competitors are going through it. So I generally try to push back on that a little bit. Yes, sir?
What do you recommend for disciplinary meetings or personal conversations that you want to have with in my case, faculty with a student or an advisor with a student?
Well, now more than ever, faculty and students need glass. There's too much litigation around all sorts of issues. The last thing a faculty member needs to be is in a solid room with the door and closed. I mean, that's just a fact of life for us. The second thing is there's a difference between disciplining and just important conversations. I mean, if you are having a conversation that's about, salary or something like that, yeah, I mean, you need to have a small conference space to do that. And if what a person does all day long is that's his or her primary job, that person may need an assigned space. If it's something you do once a year with your team when the reviews come out, the question for the organization is that enough to mean that person has a private office all the time? Now, space and money are not an issue, it may not be a problem. As far as the discipline goes, that's a different story. And I will tell you that all the time, I have especially managers that are being moved out into the open area for very good reasons, which I'm going to get to in a minute, because it's better team dynamics. And the managers invariably will say, but I need a private office because I spend a lot of time disciplining my employees. And my pushback on that is you've got a bigger problem in your office. If you're spending that much time disciplining employees, let's not create a space that's going to enable that behavior. Let's try and figure out why this is happening. And did you ever think that maybe if you were sitting out with your team, part of them every day working with them, that maybe some of those issues might diminish? Not all, but they would certainly go away. And a case in point is, if you've got someone who's really problematic in the organization, maybe they're borderline, they cause a lot of problems, you're not quite sure what you're going to do with them. If you're sitting in an open office and you're their manager and you're sitting next to them, that problem's going to resolve itself pretty quickly, one way or another, right? But this notion of taking people that are in some position of authority and pushing them in a space and calling them in, once every couple of months to talk about their performance, you may not know this, but that is totally a vestige of World War II. Before World War II, we had no such thing as the fitness rep, which is what they call it, the military fit rep. How many of you are former military? You may know that. Before World War II, we didn't even have it. That whole notion of servicemen returning and officers coming back into the organization, they decided that was a good thing to do. Before World War II, everybody just sat out at big tables together. And if you were a problem, well, you were my bookkeeping clerk. I knew about it. And I said, hey, wait a minute, hold on here. Let's do it this way, right? So don't wait a year and call me in and say, your attitude's a 3.2. Let's get it up to a 3.4 next year. What does that mean, right? What it's better to do is manage your city as a team. So private conversations that need to happen, whether they're about salary or personal things, yeah, you do need to provide space for that. If the person does that 24 hours, that's their job. They may need their own space to do that. But for just stuff like disciplining employees, I would say let's find the root of the problem and try and solve it another way. Don't make space. Don't involve space in that. But that's the ideal point. I know it's not always ideal. Okay, let's move on. Now, I actually just started to talk about this one already, is one of the, this is not so much a research result, I think, as it is an effect that we're seeing in the workplace, is more and more and more and more organizations are breaking down that hierarchical structure, in particular around middle management. Now, again, you may not know this, but before World War II, the notion of middle management didn't really exist. You had departments, and there was a head of the department. He was head of bookkeeping. I'll say he because it's probably he. He was head of bookkeeping. He was head of accounting. He was head of payroll. He was head of marketing. And he had a bunch of guys that worked for him. Around 1910, 1915, women got involved. They got into the office because they were the typewriters, right? They worked the type machine. But everyone sort of sat out, and you were sort of the leader, and then there was your team or your group, right? What happened in World War II, though, is you had an influx again of people coming back who had been sort of immersed in this military command and control, pay grade, authority structure for many years, and they mapped it onto the workplace. At the same time, you also have an explosion in the service industry, whether it's banking and finance, or whether it's marketing, advertising, public relations, law firms, tremendous growth in services that had nothing to do with manufacturing. And you have one more important thing that happened in the late 50s, early 60s, that of course changed the whole business world. Anybody want to tell me what that is? What is the biggest single thing that's changed the way we all work? It's introduced in the last 15 years, computers, exactly. They were big, they took up whole rooms, and people had to have roller skates to get from one side to the other and change the tubes, right? And they didn't have as much power as this does. But computers created a tremendous amount of information. All of a sudden, you had people walking around with reports, that were stacked up this thick. Remember the little dot matrix and pages and giant printers with their own cabinets, because they were so noisy. And this information explosion, right? And the jet age, global travel. So all of a sudden, you've got the need to manage this whole world of computers and information, international offices. That's where middle management came from. That's the whole place it came from. Before 1940, 45 didn't even exist as a notion. So what we're seeing is that middle management, in particular, are the group of people that are being the most impacted by workplace change today for a couple of reasons. They're still pivotal, but in most organizations today, there's not this notion of a big field of middle managers and all these worker bees who actually do the work. Everybody's doing more of the work now. Teams are more integrated. Can you imagine today having your boss sort of write out a plan by longhand on yellow legal paper and then hand it to his girl to type up, who would send it to marketing to put it in sort of presentation format, and they'd send it somewhere else to print it, and someone else to bind it, and someone else to mail it? No, I do it all, and you probably all do it all. And that's how we're changing. And one of the biggest effects we're seeing because of that and other reasons is middle managers no longer being stratified away from their teams, but being incorporated into their teams. Now, of course, some of it's being driven by cost. If you're going to save space in an organization, one of the quickest ways to do it is to eliminate layers of private offices. And this is the group that has the most of them, right? You can take senior leadership out of their offices, but it's not going to have anywhere the physical impact it takes with your big middle management group. All right, so we've got about 20 minutes left, and we'll be halfway through, so let's zip it up just a little bit here. Now, the next thing that we're seeing, and this goes back to sort of this notion of engagement, is the idea of choice. One of the things that seems to really drive people in organizations, when you talk about what makes them happy, what makes them satisfied, is this notion of choice. Whether it's when I work, where I work, how I work. You hired me, I'm smart. It's one of the reasons that a lot of people don't do punch time cards anymore. Now, those of us in the service industry still have to keep track of our billable hours, but that's just what we charge our client. But it used to be, there was a time in this country that no matter what you did, you punched a clock. And there were, the notion was that you will constantly be told what to do, how to do it, and when to do it. And one of the big shifts we've seen is people having more choice, especially around when and where they work. Now, at Herman Miller, one of the things that we've done is we've created this sort of dictionary, or this lexicon, if you will, of spaces that we have a bunch of tools. You can use them if you like. And really what they do is they try and say, here are the sort of 10 typical spaces that we see in the workstation today that people like to be able to choose from. You may have different names for yours. For example, Haven is what we call private office, because we're trying to get away from the notion of private office. It's really a place for people to go to, whether it's assigned or unassigned, where they need a long time, right? The Hive, just like you might think, is the notion of the workstation. Again, I try and stay away from the word cubicle, because it's a very negative term. It describes Dilbertville, and when you tell someone who's got a big private office you're going to a cubicle, even if it looks like those beautiful workstations, you know what they're seeing in their head, right? No, I'm not going there, right? They go through the 5 stages like death. No, they argue, then they deny it, then they negotiate. Give me my office, I'll come in on Saturday, and then they get depressed, which is bad, because that's other people, and finally they accept it, right? So words are very, very powerful. The other one is the meeting space. And if you look at these 3 right here, Haven, Hive, and meeting spaces, those are the big 3. And for 30 or 40 years, that's been our big concern in the workplace designing process, right? Most people would start their workplace process with somebody creating a spreadsheet. How many workstations, how many offices, how many conference rooms. That's what we do. I'm going to tell you that's not the way to start a project. If you're starting a project that way, you're doing it wrong, and that's probably, you want to stop doing that. But that's the way we've always done it. Our big concern was how many of these? And what we didn't say is, well, wait a minute. How are you really working? What are better ways for you to work? And how would choice help you get your job done better, right? So all we've done at Herman Miller, and Leslie and her team would be happy to come to any of y'all and talk about all of these in more detail. You can see some of these settings as you move around today. What's really important is not the actual settings, it's the fact that people have choice about where they're going to work and when and how. Now, the next thing that we're seeing is, and this is coming from the ergonomic literature, it's my little animation, and that is, and I'm sure y'all all seen this explosion in the sit-to-stand business and the walking things, and I'm sitting at a sit-to-stand table. I will tell you an insider little secret. We all got a note last week from the production, from the manufacturing people in Michigan, saying, hey, watch out, we have such an upswing in orders for sit-to-stand tables that we're running a few days behind what we normally do. It said this unexpected surge in orders for sit-to-stand. So what we know is it's really, really taken off. Part of it has to do with choice. People have choice about when and how they want to work. A lot of it has to do with it makes it easier for a lot of facilities people to not, to let people be able to set their own height. And we know from research in ergonomics, and we say this all the time at Herman Miller, when people say, what's the best position to sit in? Who knows? Herman Miller people can't answer this question. But who knows what's the best position to work in? Anybody know?
A different one.
A different one, right. The next one.
Yeah.
The next one. The important thing is not to say static. And that's the cool thing about the sit-to-stand or any kind of sort of adjustable chair. So are y'all seeing an upswing in your clients asking for sit-to-stand? Yeah, in fact, I was working on a bank in in Texas. They're installing 2,000 workstations. Every person is getting a sit-to-stand table. And that's pretty amazing, right? So that's the next big thing we're seeing. And the other thing I wanted to share with y'all was a little shift we're seeing in technology, where we're going from 2 monitors being standard at every desk. How many of y'all all have 2 monitors at the desk, even if it's a monitor and a laptop, right? Well, here's what we're seeing. We're seeing 3 become standard for a lot of companies now. Generally, it's not really 3 monitors unless you're a broker or something. What we're really seeing is people having a big monitor, then they've got their laptop, And we track this because we sell these arms, and we know what people are buying. And so what we're seeing is that people are doing their primary work on the one in the middle. They tend to have their research up, or they're searching the internet, or they have some report up that they're reading. And then the third one usually involves their communications, their mail, their Twitter, their chat, their cloud, their NIMBY, whatever all that stuff is. All right? So this is a big change we're seeing in the workplace. One of the things when I work with people I like to do is, I personally am very fond of the 7x7 workstation for lots and lots of reasons. It's room for a second person to sit. It's a nice big workspace. I always make sure people have 30 inches. But one of the nice things about the big 7-foot workstation, I never put people in interior cockpit stations, it's at corners anymore, is that you've got lots of space for all of that stuff. The other thing is I always make sure I've got at least 30 inches down. Sometimes I see people put in a nice work surface that's long, but it's 24 inches. You never want to do that because you're going to end up kicking the panel or people underneath it, right? Plus, 24 and a little 3-inch panel and another 24, that's too close. I don't want to get that close to you. I don't know what you make for lunch. That extra 6 inches, I'm not picking on you, sorry. That extra 6 inches on either side is really nice. But the 3 monitors is definitely something we're beginning to see. Now, the next one we're beginning to see, and again, we track this in sales, is, and someone asked, and she's not here today, was that Ann was asking about storage last night. We're seeing a pretty dramatic reduction in paper storage, both at the desk and also just company-wide. This is obviously happening for a lot of reasons. A lot of stuff that you used to get in paper form you can't get anymore. And we were talking about the fact that when I first started as a designer, I had a whole set of Sweets catalogs at my desk. Can you imagine how much space that takes up? Right? I had every issue of Interior Design Magazine and Contract and all those magazines, and we had tons and tons and tons of stuff. And what we find now is that, of course, you can't even get a lot of that stuff anymore. It's all online. But what we also find is that people tend to, as you know, we all got a little bit of hoardiness. We all do. So one of the things we're seeing is organizations who are trying to save space recognize the fact that if you're going to cut space out, you don't want to cut people space out. You want to cut paper storage space out. So we're seeing many fewer file cabinets, but the ones we are seeing, we're seeing them used a lot more in conjunction with a common worktop and put in areas that teams can also double use as sort of stand-up meeting zones. I'm sure y'all are seeing that too, right? One of the things that I do with organizations, I'm sure y'all do this also, is do these audits where companies will say, I've got to have X amount of storage. And usually it's because someone in the company has gone around and counted all the file cabinets they have now. And they put them on a spreadsheet and added a 10% growth factor. When in fact, you should do the opposite. You should go 10% reduction or something. And of course, what happens when you don't open these is they're full of just usually junk, right? Or I'll look under someone's desk, and especially in design firms, and I'll say, look, that's a 95% progress set from a project that closed out 3 years ago. You think you might be perfect at that, right? But it's tough for a lot of people. But this is definitely a trend that we're seeing. Are y'all seeing this trend too, the reduction in storage and personal storage? Now, the very last slide, we've got about 10 minutes left here. The very last thing I want to talk about is not so much the research that's coming out of the research industry, but is actually the response to this research. As I mentioned to you earlier, one of the things that I've seen quite a bit of is companies that are saying, look, we recognize that we don't any longer want to create these very complicated typicals and standards that are based on, we used to take the org chart, right? And the person at the top got the biggest office, and the next line down got the next size offices, and the next line down got the next size offices. And you keep going down until you get to open workstations, and then you got like a 12 by 15, and 10 by 12, and then 8 by 12. Exactly. Yeah.
Nothing
Sorry.
changes except the height
Height of the chair, or you get a wood trash can, or so this is a nightmare. It's a nightmare, and it continues to reinforce the notion that I'm better than you, and that space tells everyone in the place that I'm better than you, that I'm more important than you. And what this really means is, for most organizations today, are recognizing that it's a foolish way to use resources. It's a very inflexible way. It's not good for the facilities people. It's not good for the environment, and it's a nightmare from an HR perspective. I will tell you that last summer I was working with a pretty big organization down in Florida where they had hired 2 people who were both the same level on the org chart, which meant because of where they were on the org chart, they got offices, right? Because again, they had tied your title to your space. And they put these two people in their offices. In one office, just because of the architecture of the building, one office was about 7 inches wider than the other. Well, you know what happened. The person who had 7 inches less filed an HR complaint. All right? Now, I will tell you what happened in that case. The owner of the company, who was relatively new, came in and said, you know what? Get rid of every office. Nobody's going to have offices. That takes care of that. This is like something your mother would do, right? I'm going to solve the problem right here. But the bottom line is that 7 inches, the fact that that person didn't have it was so strongly ingrained, and that means that somehow I'm not considered as important as that person. But organizations today that are looking to get away from that are saying, well, what do we put in its place? You know, if we're not going to have these standards that are based on pay grades, which again, World War II came totally from the war, we didn't have it before then, right? What are we going to put in its place? Well, here's something that I offer up. And there's lots of ways to skin this cat, but I think here's another way of looking at creating typicals and workplace standards as part of a workplace strategy. Think about this for a second, and think about yourself. If you're at your desk, whether it's in a workstation or office, doesn't matter, it's a different question. I don't care if you work for P&G, if you work for NASA, if you work for the government, you know, if you work for the school board. It doesn't matter. If you're at your desk, you're on the computer, you're on the phone, or you're reading or writing something. Or you might just be sitting and looking out the window, right? That's all. That's what you're doing. I don't care if you're the owner of the company or if you're an intern that started yesterday. When you're at your desk, you're on the phone, you're on the computer, you're reading or writing something, you're sitting and thinking. And if you're really smart, you might be doing all those things, right? Or you're with other people. The only way that people really differ at work, unless you're running some kind of machine, I'm talking about corporate knowledge workers, is how much mobility you need to get your job done and how much collaboration you need to get your job done. So one thing to think about, especially with a new client who comes in and says, we want a whole new way of working. We want to create a whole new workplace. So here's a list of offices, workstations, and conference rooms we need. It's like, just put that to the side. Let's talk about the profile of your employees based on how much collaboration they need and how much mobility they enjoy to get their job done. Right? Now, when we talk about mobility, a lot of times I've seen organizations have two camps. You're mobile or you're not. You know, you get assigned workspace or you don't. Right? And my theory is that that is too severe. It is too black and white. That when you look at organizations, people generally fall more into one of three camps, right? The first camp in the middle, which is where most of us probably fall, as I mentioned earlier, we're flex workers. What does that mean? It means that we're at our assigned desk, again, whether it's an office or a workstation, about half the time. The rest of the time, we're in meetings. We're at a colleague's desk. We're in a conference room. We might be out with clients. We're at Starbucks. We're at the hotel. We're at home. We're at our desk about half the time. Now, my theory, and when I say half, I usually say 40 to 60%, just a range. My feeling about people who fall in that category is that we still need a place to call our own. It could be smaller. It could have less storage. But we need a place where we can sort of leave our stuff and know that that's our home, right? Now, because it's smaller and maybe it doesn't take as much real estate and maybe it doesn't have as much storage, that means it's okay for me, even though I have a desk, it's okay for me to go work over there that day. I'm not wasting space. Part of that collective space that we took a little bit from everybody, we were able to put in these other spaces. So I can have choice. It goes back to engagement. So I can have choice. I want to sit on the sofa today. I want to sit over there. You know, I want to lay down in the hospital bed back there, right? Now, that's how most of us fall. But you've got outliers. The first outlier are people that we call residents. Residents are people who are at their desk all day long. There's nothing about their job that requires them or even allows them to be away from their desk. Call center, customer support, a lot of administrative support. These people are pretty much at their desk all day. Clearly, they need an assigned space, but they also probably need a little bit bigger space and a little bit more storage. Now, the irony of that is three of the most common groups that fall into that, call center, sort of customer support, or particularly admins, they tend to be the ones who get the smaller workstation because they're lower on the totem pole of paper. But in fact, they're the ones who probably need more space. Y'all have all seen that funny picture of the big boss sitting at his giant desk with no papers on and his feet up, and then the poor little clerk who's doing all the work sitting like at a stool with a little TV tray, right? That's what's going on here. These people actually get the most work done, and they're there all day. They need to have the best views, and they need to have the best, sort of the biggest space. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are really mobile. Now, when I'm talking about mobile people here, I'm not talking about outside sales. I'm talking about people who in the normal course of events would have had an office or a workstation. right? But they're always, almost always gone. They're only in that seat maybe 10%, 20% of the time. And remember, 10% in an average work week, that's just 4 hours a day. 20% is coming in 1 day a week. Now, my thought about these people, unless you've got tons of real estate, tons of money, and it doesn't matter, is that these are people that probably are okay not having a workstation. As long as there's plenty of good choices for them to sit when they get there. I'm not talking about a couple of old broken study carrels in the back where the mobile people sit. But I'm talking about being integrated into the rest of the workstation. And I will tell you, people who are truly mobile, like I am, we don't want to keep stuff at work. I mean, if I'm truly mobile and I'm sitting at home and I realize that I left that report in my mobile cubby and I'm supposed to pull out of a closet, every day, I'm going to be really mad because I need that report on my computer. So this notion of giving sort of all this really mobile people, all these little cubbies and all these little lockers and all this stuff they can pull out, I can tell you, we see people do it all the time and I'm not seeing them get used. Because truly mobile people have got technological savvy, they're going to want to keep the stuff on the computer, or like I do, it's all in the cloud somewhere up there. Right? So one way you can go into an organization is say, look, let's categorize people not by what they do, their job title, how long they've been here, how old they are, whatever. Let's just look at what percentage of people are resident, flex, and mobile. Now, I will tell you the way that I get this information is through that space utilization we talked about earlier, the motion detectors under the chair. It allows me to go, you know what, Acme Incorporated, you're 50% mobile, you're 60% flex, and the rest, I'm trying to do that, the rest is all resident. So when you start designing your floor plate, that's about the way the percentages should work out. Plus, if you take that mobile part and assign a sharing ratio to it, you can actually increase the capacity on your floor, because now all the mobile stations are really 2 to 1. Now, creating all of that documentation, by the way, is a pretty intensive effort, and it's something that I do a lot. I can share some with you that I've done in the past, where you can start to do what-if scenarios. If we have these 3 percentages, and this bottom percentage has a sharing ratio of X, then what is the true capacity of this floor? What head count will it support, for example? Now, that's one part of the matrix. Remember I talked about mobility and collaboration? So let's say that you understand how an organization works in terms of mobility. The other thing that we want to look at is how those work in terms of collaboration. And for collaboration, you can think of it as sort of two sort of areas on the spectrum. The first one is teams. Now, I'm going to talk about teams and groups, and I just want to say I know that people use teams and groups synonymously, but they do not mean the same thing when you look at the workplace literature, right? Teams are people where everyone is doing something different, but they're doing it for the same project or the same client. An architectural team, a design team, a new product development team are classic examples. In an architectural team, I'm doing the ceilings, you're doing the lighting, you're doing the furniture placement, you're doing the slab openings, you're doing the ceilings. We can't just all go off and do our work and hope that it's going to come together. We have to coordinate our work constantly. These are people who benefit from being in a more open, collaborative environment. On the other end, you've got people who are in groups. They are low collaboratives. They're very independent. They're primarily doing their own work. And people who are in collections of groups are generally all doing the same thing, but they're doing it for different clients or different projects. Again, customer service and call center is a classic example. In a customer service or call center, I'm doing the A's, you're doing the B's, you do the C's, you do the D's. We all do the exact same thing, but we're doing it for different clients. Project managers, lawyers, college professors. If a lawyer has a case and you have a case, we're both lawyers, we're both doing the same thing. We may be part of the same group, personal injury litigation group. But every time I make a decision with my client, I have to run over and show them you, right? If I did, in fact, I wouldn't get my work done, right? This group does not have to coordinate their work. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't need some collaboration for socialization, for enculturation, for getting help. But they don't need to be put in an environment where they're constantly being bombarded by other work that's going on around them, okay? So that's the other thing, is get people to talk about, not that you're a director 4, you're a manager 3, you're an admin 2. Just tell me, are you fairly autonomous and independent, and the people in your group are all doing sort of the same thing but for different people, like project managers? Or are you highly interdependent on the other people in your sort of area, and without the other people's input, you could not get your job done? So then, when you do that, what you end up with is this matrix of sort of 6 cells, if you will. high and low collaborators, resident flex mobile. And if you can get people to talk about that, and then, if you really want the cherry on top, use a kit of parts that creates very simple workstations and offices that support each one of those with only slight changes. Start with the flex in the middle. For the mobile, you subtract a little. For the resident, you add a little. And for high enclosure people who are more heads down, they maybe get a little bit more enclosure, more panels, right? I'm trying to use the word privacy, more enclosure. If they're really heads down with all the time by themselves, then, well, you could ask why do they come to work? Maybe they're better off staying home. Or then they definitely might be a candidate for even a private office, right? So we kind of say, if we throw out our standards based, and I will tell you that oftentimes when I ask people where their standards came from, the standards book on the shelf that they're using with all those typicals, typical A1, A1B, A13, you know, who needs that many, you know, who needs 20 variations, right? Most people cannot tell me who developed their standards. So, well, they were here when I got here, right? How many times were there? I don't know. Well, we got to use them because this is what we have. If you have an organization that says we recognize that we don't want to go down this path anymore, what can we do in its place? All I'm saying is this is one possibility. You don't have to use these two categories. In fact, I'm working with a national agency that is in charge of security for this country, and they're actually using mobility and security as opposed to mobility and collaboration levels. So they've got high security, low security people, resident, flex, and mobile. So lots of different ways to do it, but it's a much more logical approach than saying, okay, you're an admin 2, but tomorrow you're going to be promoted to admin 1, so I'm going to bring over the tall back chair or the wood trash can. Is that going to make you work better when you get some 3 inches on your back of your chair? I mean, that's what we call the throne phenomenon. That as people got, you know, more and more, the back of the chair got bigger and bigger. You know, so finally, at some point, they're like on a stage. What's going on there? We know you're the boss. We don't come in your chair. Okay, so I have waxed on for 1 hour now. So those are sort of 10 big things that we're seeing in the workplace that I think maybe are changing the way we think about designing work. And happy to take thoughts or ideas or suggestions, questions. Anybody got to push back? Have you seen any of this stuff happen out there in the workplace?
Margaret, can you touch on from last night the Ajax and just a little, like 2 minutes on the perimeter, the use of the perimeter?
Yeah. What Jane is talking about is Ajax is a program that I use to actually analyze plans to see which ones are going to produce the most amount or more movement and counter. And it's a pretty cool little tool. You can look it up. It's called Ajax, A-J-A-X. If you search for space syntax and Ajax, it'll pull this thing up. And actually, I can see my computer from here. I can show you the one that I just finished last night. If I can get out of this. What we found from this, I can't see what I'm doing, I'm sorry, is that when you look at space and the way the space is laid out, if you want to create more collaboration, probably the most important thing that you can do is eliminate dead ends from your workplace. I can't see it. I really would love to show it to you, but I can't get to the little button on there. Is eliminate dead ends. And what we find is that work plans, workspaces can be like cities. They can be highly balanced in the circulation of their grid, or they can be like cities that have one main street with lots of little cul-de-sacs off of them. And when you have plans that are like that, and how those cul-de-sacs get made in the workplace is when people take 6 and 8 packs of workstations and push them up against the perimeter window. And what happens is you get these big main paths, usually around the core, and then you get all these little cul-de-sacs off of them. And what we found is when we look at collaboration in the workplace, and this Apex tool, all it does is just highlight those and give you some metrics around it. It prevents people from having sort of choice about where they move around and how many people they can see. I mean, if you're going down this hallway and you're going from, let's say, the entry to the break room, you're not going to go down every one of those little aisles on your way to the space. You're not going to do that. But if there was perimeter circulation, then it would allow people to move around freely and have lots more choices. And what we find is that when we eliminate dead ends, it dramatically increases the number of routes that are available on the floor plan, and it also increases the depth. Depth is the number of average turns it takes to get from one place to another.
And the point was is that then it also increases the amount of unintentional collaborative
Informal
interaction,
interaction.
informal
Yeah.
interactions.
And when people come to me and say, we want to create more informal interactions, so we're putting in this, roomy coffee bar, and we're putting in the big bag chairs and big pong tables, the response is, there's no empirical evidence that that has any link whatsoever to collaboration. In fact, the only thing that we know that supports collaboration is providing layouts with lots of choices and making sure that you've accounted for the average distance between people and put stuff into the space to sort of get people up out of their comfort zone, which is about a 30-meter radius. And the last one is visibility. We know that when people have more visibility, you can see, make eye contact with, or at least see people, awareness, even if they don't contact them, then that only not increases opportunities for informal interaction, it also increases all that engagement stuff we talked about earlier. So layout, distance, and visibility are the only three variables that are related in any way to a collaborative workplace. And so when people tell you we're going to take out, these workstations at the end and we're going to call it a collaborative zone, it's not going to get you there. And I see this happen all the time. Right? I wish I could show you this, but I just can't get to the screen. Hold on a second. I'll just show it to you.
Yeah, it's pretty impactful.
I was just going to say
Yeah.
Yeah, just to see, yeah, it's pretty
I
impactful.
can't see the trial button, on this thing, because it's getting shot off. Yeah, I'll skip these parts, we already talked about this. I'll just show you how the program works. Remember, I talked about the fact that 70, 89% of interactions happens at the desk. And those are the only three variables that are connected with it. And the way that space syntax works is you draw the fewest and the longest lines that relate to the space. This AJAX program actually returns every line at every intersection with a value between 0 and 1, where 0 are lines that are going to be not traveled at all. Those are those cul-de-sacs. And 1 are lines that are going to see most of the movement. And what you want in plan is you want lots of red, orange, and yellow. You don't want just a main path with lots of other little paths coming off of it. So this one, for example, is the same plan, but I've reoriented a little bit. A, to put in perimeter circulation, to eliminate dead ends, and to create longer paths. And so you see there's a lot more red, orange, and yellow. And if you look at the two plans, the first one had 56 ways to move around. This one has 208. But just through space planning, there's 4 times as many ways for people to move around, see each other, have this sort of collaboration. And remember, it's not just about collaboration, it's about awareness, too. So that's the AJAX program, and you can download it, and all you really do is you bring a JPEG into the plan and you draw the lines, and there's buttons there to run the axial, which is the paths, and then the junction analysis, which are the intersections. And it gives you a lot of cool values, too. So if you're interested in that, and you didn't get to see the presentation last night, I do it by webinar. And also, if you download the software and want to play with it,